So, on Sunday, we were talking about the importance of having a teachable spirit and not thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought, coming from Romans chapter 12. And I want to explore a little bit more this week in the video what the true understanding of humility really is and how that humility plays out for us as a community in how we respond to other people around us. Now, it's first of all worth saying that humility is not how we often understand humility to be. We can often think that humility is about thinking lowly of ourselves and saying, "Oh, I'm not good enough to do this, and I'm not worthy enough for this," and that can be our view of humility. Now, in some senses, there is humility in that, but the humility we're talking about here, the humility we see in the Bible, has more, in fact, to do with submission than it does to do with thinking about ourselves. Because humility in the community setting is about submitting to one another above ourselves and also, of course, submitting to God. Hopefully that goes without saying. But submission is a word we don't particularly like to use and a concept that we don't particularly like to think of, which is why humility and submission go hand in hand. So, a true understanding of humility is not thinking less of ourselves and saying, "Woe is me and I'm not good enough," because that then leads to us discounting ourselves, which we introduced as another value. That it's important we don't discount ourselves, that we use the gifts and talents that God has given us, that we acknowledge them, celebrate them, and use them for His glory. But true humility is not thinking less of ourselves, but rather thinking of ourselves less. What that basically means is that we think of others more than we think of ourselves. Because the more time we spend thinking about other people, the less time we are thinking about ourselves. And that means humility then becomes quite natural to us, almost second nature. But it's not an easy thing. And the reason it's not an easy thing is because we are a people who are inherently selfish. We need to remember that selfishness is at the root of the fall. That desire to be more like God or to understand God more is what resulted in the fall of mankind through Adam and Eve. And we know that selfishness really is the root of most sin that we see in the world around us today and in our own lives. So it's quite natural that we find it difficult to be humble and to submit to one another and to not think of ourselves more highly than we ought. But this passage in Romans has something key in it that we need to remember. It was written to a corporate body. Paul was writing to an entire church. And so when he says, "Don't think of yourselves more highly than you ought," he's not writing that to an individual, although we tend to apply it that way. He's writing to a group of people. And what he's basically saying is, don't look at the community, don't look at what you're building, don't look at what you're developing and see it as better than it is. Don't look at it as being better than it is. And don't look at it as being something that's been formed by humans or by you, because actually a genuine kingdom-minded community is being formed through Jesus, who is building his church and is an outworking of his spirit at work in people's lives. Because the danger of us trying to build the community with maybe particular programs or trying particular things in a particular way to say, "Oh, look at us, we're building great community," is that it may look successful on the outside, and other churches no doubt will look to a community like that and say, "How do you do it? Tell us how you build that kind of community. Tell us how you've developed that. Give us the programs that you used or the resources that you used so we can do the same." But Jesus' desire wasn't for other churches to look at us and see that we are disciples of Jesus. His desire was for the world to see that we're disciples of Jesus. Those who don't currently know Jesus to look at us and say there's something about them that's different. And that's marked by how we love one another, not by how successful our community is in worldly terms. And so what we need to think about, if we're not thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought as a community, is that we are submitted to one another and we're submitted to God. And in genuine humility, we think more of others than we think of ourselves. And what we find is when we're doing that, then we have a teachable spirit. Because if we come across somebody who thinks differently from us or has a different opinion or theology than us, then if we're thinking of them more than we're thinking of ourselves, then we will be genuine in our listening. We will hear their story and hear their point of view. And that leaves us open to recognize that we may have it wrong. We haven't necessarily got it right all of the time. And that requires me submitting to you and us submitting to one another and us together being submitted to God and allowing Him to build the kind of community He wants to build as we surrender fully to Him. So true humility is not thinking, woe is me and I am rubbish. It's looking at the gifts that God has given you, celebrating those and using them to His glory, but also using them for the benefit of others. It means listening to others. It means thinking of them more than you think of yourself. And when we're able to do those things, then that will mark us as a community. And genuine love and community amongst us will be a natural outworking of that kind of humility. And the world will see that we are disciples of Christ by how we love one another in humility, not thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought. Grace and peace to you as you seek to be as humble as you can in the right way for His glory.